today. Tonight in Mumbai, 10 to 12 people who left home early in the morning today for their work or for their education will not reach home, either on their way to work or they come back from home to work. As they trespass across the railway tracks in Mumbai, they will get hit by a train and they will die. And this is the largest cause of death in Mumbai city. We have data. We know 85% of those who are dying are people from the age of 15 to 35, men of 15 to 35. 85% of dead are people, men at the age of 15 to 35. We know that 90% of the deaths are happening during broad daylight. And I know if you just stand there as to where people cross and just look at it, you know that they can see the trains coming in. And I think the big question that will pass through our minds is, but why? Why is he getting hit by the train? Can he not see the train coming in? Somewhere the answer as to why, when they're doing what they're doing, is somehow is not getting answered. So what do? And we were fairly clear that somewhere we have to go beyond the data, because the data is not providing me the answers to the problem. We also knew, as we discussed in the morning, there are the existing ways of working, and that's not going to help. And something else is what we need to move towards. A newer understanding and more significant understanding of human behavior is what we need to move towards. And we became, in 2008 when we started, the first organization in the world, and as a combination, even today might be the only organization in the world that combines learnings from cognitive neuroscience, behavioral economics, and design. And much before the books were even published, I think we started an organization and started working on these projects. But I think the knowledge that came from these sciences, I can assure you, I think in the traditional world we said human behavior is mostly conscious, and I know what I'm doing. But today neuroscience is saying no. 99.99% of my behavior happens at a non-conscious level, and my consciousness has no clue about it. The traditional way said rational thinking is the best way to think about and keep emotions away. Now today neuroscience is saying emotional parts of the brain are involved in every decision, which means all decisions we take, there is emotional facet to it. Behavioral science, I know traditionally we said that man is someone who optimizes things, compares things, and he takes the best decision that's available. But behavioral economics is clearly saying the brain doesn't have the time nor the ability to process all the information, and so it will take shortcuts called heuristics. So understanding those heuristics becomes very important if you have to really unravel the decision process. Somewhere in our world of mass media and focus groups, we were away from the context when we were trying to understand human behavior. But today we says one of the biggest influence of a human behavior is the context. So whether it's our research or it's the communication, be in the context, be at the point of action. Now, this knowledge, as we said, I could have fitted in to make a better focus group methodology. I could have used it to make a better 30-second commercials. But as Luke mentioned in the morning, what we had the audacity was threw all that out of the traditional ways. And the team went on to develop a new market research technique called Ethno Lab, which Anurag will speak about it in detail. We created new strategic frameworks to understand human behavior. And instead of the traditional 30-second commercial and the press ad, we said there has to be a new way to create communication. Communicate to the non-conscious. And I think with this understanding, we could go back to the railway tracks and say, why is he doing what he's doing? And I think we said it's because there is a deficiency in our human brain. I think our forefathers, when they saw a rabbit or a deer going in, They knew the speed at which, and they threw the spear perfectly and killed it and had their breakfast that day. But there was, evolutionarily, we haven't seen large objects move. The elephants and giraffes never moved fast. And things started moving fast in the last 100, 150 years. And today, brain, the millions of years of evolution, the 200 is a small little thing. Even now, the brain is not equipped to judge the speed of a large object. We underestimate it by close to 40%. So I'm seeing train, I can cross. And I cross, the train is much closer than what it is. Gone. And that was the problem. That means the underestimation of the human brain, of the speed. Now, there is a traditional way I could have done it. But we have created, as I said, a new methodology of communication wherein we create artifacts, design artifacts, where people can see, but they have no clue how this artifact is actually influencing their behavior, which means we are actually influencing people's behavior without they being consciously being aware of. So how did we solve this problem? Now, our traditional communication would have been what automotive industry does around the world. Now that we know people can't judge the speed of large objects, we could have put up boards which says, like automotive industry said, objects in the mirror are closer than what they appear. But we know when we are trying to take that little turn there, there's no way our brain is saying that object is closer. So similarly, if we had put up boards across from Bombay with saying that trains are faster than what you think, be careful, we knew it wouldn't have worked. I think my design team went a bit more deeper. They said, how does the brain judge speed? The brain judges speed always with a reference point. If there's no reference point, as it happens when we're on a flight, we can't judge the speed. So he said, how do we create a reference point for the person who's crossing the railway track? Now, this is where people cross. But just few sleepers on the other side, 5 of them painted yellow, 15 you leave it empty, then you have another 5. So as the train is coming from there, the speed at which the blobs actually disappear under the train at a non-conscious level becomes a reference for me and allow the train to pass by. Now, this has now become a worldwide case study. The latest Kotler's book you'll find called Wadala Case Study is now a case study for the world to look at how can we use this new science to influence public behavior. I think Srikanth and I speak a fair bit on some of where is the future. And we are fairly convinced about it. Obviously, data that gives you a brilliant understanding of what people do. But why did they do what they did is something which the behavioral sciences can actually unravel for us. But we also said understanding the consumer, yes, that's a good offering, and I'm sure as a client you would be happy. But I'm sure you'll be even more happier when we say, hey, we can now design interventions for you at the point of action which would actually now change the behavior the way we want. That means bringing design for the non-conscious. Over the last 10 years, we worked across the world, US to Europe, to Africa, to India, to different parts of Asia. Across sectors, financial services, healthcare, developmental, to CPG, to all of them. Now, Anurag will take you through 2 of those case studies and just shows how the process, our approach to a problem, and finally, how we deliver behavioral change. And you can see the results.
Thank you, Biju. So over the next 20 minutes, I want to kind of talk a little bit about the process we follow to kind of bring this science into application, right? Yesterday in the bus, Marlene and I were talking about how some of the solutions we do seem to suggest that it's just intuitive brilliance, right? So you kind of think about it and you come across some principles of science that are written in some of the books, and then you apply it and you get results. Sometimes you get results, sometimes you don't get results. But from the very beginning, we were very focused on creating a process-based application of this science, right? And if you would appreciate, right, the moment you talk about non-conscious, you start to think about what do we do with research, right? Because so much of research is claimed, what people tell us about what they know. But if it's about the non-conscious, then they don't know. So how can you ask them and get an answer for it, right? Jokingly, it's said that a lot of claimed research is just lies honestly told. So people are just being honest, but they're still lying. And so, when I run through the case studies, the cases may or may not be relevant to your industry, But what you will see is also a depiction of process, and see how Ethno Lab research tries to some extent overcome this challenge of separating what people say from what they do and what they mean, right? We'll show you how we've kind of developed games to get people to showcase their behavior, showcase their decision making, rather than just kind of tell us why they did what they did. And interestingly, as much as we might like to kind of go away from talking to people and getting a sense of their decision making, we are nowhere close to doing that yet. But one of the things that happens is that when you talk to people in a hot state is when they're making some decisions and you talk to them then, it's a very different revelation as compared to when people are in a cold state, right? So somebody bought a Pepsi, had a Pepsi a week back, and asking him why he did what he did and why didn't he choose a Coke is asking him in a very cold state, right? The memories have changed, those contexts has changed, and so what you might get is even worse memories, right? But if somebody just picked a Coke in front of you, right, and you ask him then, your chances of finding something out of it is slightly higher. I'm not saying it's ideal, but it's a little better than that, right? So what we do with games is get people to make lots of decisions, show their behaviors, and once they've done that, then kind of talk to them to figure out if they have some sense of what drove those decision making, right? The second part is insights, right? And my belief is from a research you get insights that you look for, right? So if you're looking for justifying narratives, if you're looking for RTBs, if you're looking for logical narratives, you'll get that, right? And if you're not, you can look for something else and you'll get it. So it's not that emotions is something new to us. It's just that in a lot of research, we don't look for it. We don't look for mental models. We don't look for aspects of the context which is influencing the decision making, right? So when what we mean by strategic frameworks is nothing but trying to make sense of people's preference construction by looking at the role that emotions, heuristics, and context is playing rather than the logical narratives they create for you. And the more you kind of understand those parts of the decision-making process, the more accurately you're able to understand the preference construction. And finally, non-conscious design, which Biju talked about, that ultimately the objective, the ambition, is to create more and more design that's like the yellow lines, right? So non-conscious, so not available to your conscious brain, and yet it drives behavior change, yet it kind of saves lives, right? So let's look at the first case study. This is a very, very challenging piece of work that we did in Zambia and Zimbabwe for the Gates Foundation, 2 markets outside of South Africa, which is highly, infected by the HIV virus. A lot of work happens in those markets. I mean, for any of you who has been to those markets, you would see the amount of, decibels that are spent on communicating the benefits of safe sex and so on and so forth, right? And one of the tools to kind of, reduce spread of the virus is to get people to voluntarily circumcise themselves, right? So if you undergo a medical circumcision voluntarily, it can reduce the risk by as much as 60%, right? And Gates has tremendous kind of objectives around it. They want to kind of get about 3.4 million, infections averted by getting almost 60% of the adults, young adults circumcised in that market, right? Interestingly, this is not anything new. I mean, if you look at VMMC, or you look at cigarette smoking, or you look at any other strong behavioral challenge, you'll find the same thing. Like, there's a lot of awareness about what you want to do. In this case, there is strong intent to actually get themselves circumcised, but when it comes to action, the numbers are really, really low. The job for us was to, one, explain this gap between intent and action, and then find ways of influencing this behavior, right? I was in Bulawayo. I was personally involved in this project, and I met this 9-year-old kid, and I asked him, so what do you think are the benefits of circumcision? And he said, it will provide better satisfaction to my partner. It will protect my future generations, and it will give me hygiene, and so on and so forth, right? So much of advertising dollar is spent on generating the beliefs, the benefits, right, that everybody knows it. Everybody knows about it. Even a 9-year-old kid says the same thing as much as a 26-year-old man, right? but the actions are not in line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a small video that captures this whole project in a nutshell, and then maybe kind of talk a little bit about some key insights and to just kind of establish the point.
In 2007, 3 large clinical studies showed a 60% reduction in the risk of female-to-male HIV infection among circumcised men in Africa. Based on this evidence, UN-AIDS and WHO recommended voluntary medical male circumcision, also known as VMMC, programs in 14 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The goal is to circumcise over 20 million men to prevent more than 3.4 million new HIV cases by 2025. But in spite of a dramatic increase of awareness around VMMC, too few men are getting the procedure. Prior research measured this lack of action, but new approaches were needed to identify how to overcome it. Previous efforts have successfully built awareness and intent, but we need to better understand the missing pieces that drive action. In short, we're faced with a complex human problem that needs a systemic human-centered approach to behavior change. Our approach set out to establish a human-centered map of the system that could identify strategic opportunities. Independently funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, conducted under the leadership of the government ministries and in support of the VMMC program partners, we focused on Zambia and Zimbabwe, 2 countries with a high prevalence of HIV and low rates of male circumcision. To understand the challenges, we created a custom methodology that borrows from successful approaches in the private sector. Our goal? To identify the beliefs and mental models that keep men from achieving circumcision and to develop strategies to address them. Teams of local moderators were trained to conduct interviews and game scenarios in their native languages. They were given a simple, comprehensive toolkit that was used to map men's paths to VMMC. The research was implemented across 6 regions in Zambia and 7 in Zimbabwe. This method identified scenarios to explore mental models and emotions that drive behavior using a game-like approach. After interviewing 1,300 boys, men, and their influencers, we were able to identify key beliefs, motivations, mental models, and emotions that drive a man's decision-making process. The synthesized maps and game scenarios revealed visual patterns. These patterns identified common pathways to VMMC as well as barriers that limit progress. The result is a new systematic understanding grounded in the human decision-making process for VMMC. Now we have a holistic view to explain why men behave the way they do. We can change behavior by activating the right influencers and leveraging man's internal drivers. This understanding enables us to align efforts toward the elimination of dissonance that currently inhibits men from getting circumcised, resulting in behavioral changes that will decrease HIV and save lives.
So yeah, let me show you one quick map, right? So what we eventually ended up doing was use all these research techniques. So some of the research techniques that you saw in the video were actually manual versions of the digital tools we typically use. It's just that in those markets, because of lack of Wi-Fi connectivity, electricity, and everything else, we had to convert it into a very, very manual kind of a tool. But they actually does digital games most of the time. So, briefly to kind of talk about this piece, we kind of map the journey of the customer, of the adult male from the time he starts to think about circumcision to the time he actually gets himself circumcised. And as I said in the beginning, like a lot of work happens in the phase of relating with the problem and relating with the process, right? And at that time, the long-term benefits and the short-term consequences come together in a way in which most of the emotions around that decision is very, very positive, right? So it creates a lot of intent, a lot of awareness, a lot of desire for getting themselves circumcised. But as you kind of move into stages where you start to think of getting yourself circumcised, get yourself registered, what we saw was the emergence of a lot of cognitive and emotional dissonance, right? And you could see how it would happen, right? So for instance, right, this whole idea of pain, for instance, becomes real, right? You start to now think, how painful is this process? how much is the recovery time. It's not that these were not available to you, it's just our human minds. Till you get to that situation, you don't think about those things, right? Think about, the recovery process, the shame that comes with it. I've seen women in Zimbabwe and Zambia make fun of men who go through circumcision because for several days they can't walk properly, they're kind of sitting at their homes, they're missing their jobs and everything else. Kids are making fun of them the way they kind of walk because it's a recovery process that takes time, right? Now, when you're thinking of awareness and relation, it's all fine. The moment you start thinking of getting yourself circumcised, all of these problems kind of come to the surface, right? So the net of all of these things were that we wanted to go back to the organization and all those implementing partners and tell them that you should stop focusing on creating more belief for the program. What you need to do is really start addressing the dissonance that happens closer to getting themselves circumcised, and which means that you need to go away from long-term benefit communication to more communication around what is the pain, how much is the pain, right? How long does it take to recover from these processes? Because something that doesn't happen at an advertising level, nor does it happen by those people who are getting circumcised. Because when they come out of the circumcision, they go back to doing the same thing that the advertisers are doing. They talk about it in macho language, right? Men got to do what they got to do, you got to be brave, this and that. But they don't talk about the real problems, right? So all of this led to several kind of counterintuitive changes in their program. One was more transparent communication around pain. We created a pain scale for the market so they could relate to what does it mean. So is it like a prick of a thorn, or is it like when you get hurt in a football game, right? So what is the level of pain? We went and told them, stop getting partners to become advocates of circumcision. It's a very curious case, right? So if I went to my partner and said, I want to get circumcised, right, it's the beginning of all the distrust that you can think about, right? So partner is saying, if you are loyal to me, why do you need to get circumcised, right? If the lady comes and tells the man, get circumcised, the guy is saying, oh, this lady only wants to get more pleasure out of sex, because that's what it does. She's not bothered about my hygiene or my kind of condition, right? So it creates a lot of distrust. So we said, let's get partner out of the equation. Let's use friends to kind of communicate the benefits and kind of push people into getting themselves circumcised. So a lot of these solutions saw the light of the day. Not typically something that happens in development sector a lot, because a lot of these solutions never really kind of get measured in terms of their value. But one of these solutions did deliver a 60% increase in the number of people who kind of came for circumcision, right? So this is what we want to kind of establish as how, when you use simple mechanisms like emotions and heuristics, you're able to better identify the decision-making processes and kind of influence it correctly, right? So I have another 6 minutes. I can kind of walk you through one more case study from the financial services sector. There's a case study on credit line increases, nowhere near as good as the VMMC case study, right, that we just discussed. But for all of you who are in the financial services sector, you would know that line increases are one of the most efficient strategies to drive new spends on your credit card, right? So when kind of companies proactively come and give you line increases, even though you don't need any, because the guys who need line increases never get line increases proactively, right? So only people who don't get it, and if you want to call it irrational, so be it. But these people who don't need it, they get it and they start spending more. And they actually does drive, more usage of the card. And there's contingent liability associated with this, line being put out in the marketplace. And so the company wanted us to see how we can get more of that line utilized, right? Optimize the incremental line utilization from line increase programs, right? So this is where we talk data for just 10 seconds, right? So we did a lot of data analytics on the customer behaviors. Transactional data in financial services is brilliant. You get to see almost everything they do with your card, right? And so one of the first things we wanted to do was establish different behavioral patterns associated with line increases, right? So one of the behavioral patterns could be that I wasn't using my card for a long time, I got a line increase, and then I started using my card more. right? The another one could be that I was increasing my card usage and then I got a line increase and it went up even further, right? Or it could be that it made no impact on my card usage behavior, or sometimes, which you recognize from analyzing this data, they actually can even reduce their card utilization once the line increase kicks in. And that is primarily because the industry has been giving out line increases with the belief that everybody wants line increases, right? So, I mean, if I have your credit card, I want more and more line from you, right? That's the industry belief. And forever, this has been proactively delivered to the customer and in the same way. So there is no segmentation. You just kind of go and kind of congratulate the person and say, you know what, you got X dollars of line increase. Now you have more spending capacity. Here are your 5 promotions that you can use. You can earn 5%, 3%, 1%, and so on and so forth, right? So the belief is that people are always very, very happy with line increases. And so the more you deliver to them, the more they will use it and the more happy they'll be about it. Just 1 minute on this game. So this is a game that we use very extensively for financial services work, and it's being modeled on an age-old game called Game of Life. I'm sure some of you would have played that game. It's a board game. You just kind of go around with dice and kind of roll it. It lands somewhere. Then you make some decisions about what you want to do, spend money, don't spend money, right, kind of thing, and just kind of go to the end of the game. So we created this game in which we told people we want to see how they make purchase decisions related to various categories and so on and so forth. But what we were also studying was how they use different financial resources to finance those purchases, right? So if you have multiple different credit cards in your wallet, you want to see which credit cards get used, which don't get used, for what categories, what get used, and so on and so forth. More importantly, because it's a game and it kind of goes on for 20 odd minutes, you have a chance to intervene, right? So you could intervene and change the loyalty program on a card. You could intervene and offer a BT program on a card. You could intervene and give a line increase on the card and see how the behavior changes. And because you have a large enough sample size, you can actually give out line increases, or you could give out this new product in 10, 20 different ways and test a lot of your hypotheses around what drives behavior change, preference reversals in the game itself, right? So we did the same thing. We kind of ran this game with some 300 odd, credit card consumers, and we came out with very good results on it. But interestingly, it also verified for us that people in games do not behave differently from how they behave in real life. So this is a classic case where you see this game and you see how people behave. Are they transactors? Are they revolvers? And typically you will see that most people actually behave just the way they behave in real life, right? And that kind of gives you the confidence that these games work in understanding people's preferences and how to kind of modulate them, right? I think there are a lot of findings from this project, but one of the critical findings of this project was that it's not a singular emotion people feel when they get line increases, right? So not all people are very proud and feel a sense of reward and joy from line increases. In fact, a very large segment of the population have just the reverse emotion. They anticipate a lot of regret coming out of line increases. They think this is a way in which companies are trying to give them more rope to hang themselves, right? And unless you kind of understand that emotion, that prevalence of that dominant emotion, and do something about it, there is no way you can get these people to respond to line increases the way those who feel rewarded and feel a sense of pride from it, right? So I'm going to skip a couple of slides because there's just 27 seconds left on that thing. But from a solution point of view, think about it, right? If you have a sense of negative emotion about something, you're pessimistic about how these things will influence your future. We know from behavioral sciences that one of the best principles is how control drives optimism, right? So when you are driving a car, nothing's going to go wrong. When somebody else is driving a car, even the smallest deviations seem like massive errors, right? So what we did was we kind of provided a sense of control to the consumers by giving them a perception of choice around what they could do with line and how they could or could not kind of accept the lines. And equally, we segmented the consumers on the basis of these emotions and started to deliver customized direct mailers to them. And this kind of led to 50% incremental utilization of line from where they were. Right? So the idea of segmenting on emotions, the idea of using control as a way of influencing their decision making can kind of give you these kind of results, right? Something that hasn't happened for a long time for these companies, right? So these are just a couple of case studies to show you how the process works and how these simple solutions can deliver significant impact on your businesses. Thank you.